Do you like my new lamp? Wee bugger got a wee bit too boisterous when he was playing, and he scratched his eye. He's getting better though. It's open now, and you can see. He's still an absolute wee fucking gremlin, isn't he? Can't he go for 5 fucking minutes without hurting himself? The joy of pugs. Body snatching was a very common problem back in the day. Medical colleges would pay a tidy sum of money to anyone that could provide them with a body for dissection because it helped so much with medical research. So people would very often steal fresh bodies from graveyards to sell to these universities, and the men who did this were called the resurrection men. And eventually the problem gets so bad that all of the graveyards ended up being under heavy guard, which meant it was impossible for them to steal the bodies anymore. So what do you do if you can no longer steal the bodies? You just make your own. Burke and Hare. We can start with William Burke. Burke was born in 1792 in Ireland, and he had a pretty comfortable upbringing, and then he joined the army when he was a teenager. He married a woman, but it didn't last for very long because Burke ended up getting into an argument with her father in a dispute about the ownership of some land, and this resulted in Burke just simply walking out on the family and disappearing. He then moved to Scotland to become a labourer building the Union Canal, and he lived in the village of Maddiston near Falkirk, and it was while he was living here that he met his second wife, Helen McDougall, who he affectionately nicknamed Nellie. Once the work in the Union Canal had been completed, in 1827, both Burke and Nellie moved to Tanner's Close in Edinburgh. They started off as hawkers. Hawkers are people who sell second-hand goods and clothes in little portable street stalls, and Burke then went on to become a cobbler, and while he was working as a cobbler, he was pulling in about £1 a week, which was actually very good money back then. His neighbours and clients all said that he was an industrious and good-humoured man who would very often sing and dance to entertain his clients. William Hare is a little bit trickier because not much is actually known about his history. They believe that he was born in Derry in Ireland, and he was born sometime between 1792 and 1804, and they believe that while he was in Ireland he worked as a farm labourer. He too travelled to Scotland for work, and he too also ended up working on the Union Canal, but during this time him and Burke actually never met, and when the work was finished on the Union Canal, William as well moved to Tanner's Close in Edinburgh, and during this time he was working as a coalman's assistant and he was lodging with another couple. The couple he lived with was a man called Logue and a woman called Margaret Laird, and when Logue passed away, Hare started banging Margaret. Historical accounts describe Hare as uncouth, quarrelsome and violent, and it also noted the many scars he had on his face from all of the fist fights that he'd been in. Burke, Hare and their wives all travelled to Pennycook, Midlothian because they found work as harvesters, and it was while they were working here as harvesters that they all first met each other. When Logue had died, the ownership of the building transferred over to Margaret because she was seen as his spouse, so when they had all finished work on the harvest and they moved back to Edinburgh, Burke and Nellie ended up moving in with Margaret and Hare. The house had a number of rooms, so there was a bunch of other lodgers living in the building with them, and all of these lodgers paid rent to Hare and Margaret, and for a while, things were ticking along quite nicely. On the 29th of November, 1827, a lodger living in the house called Donald died of dropsy during the night. What the fuck is dropsy? Hare moaned about this to Burke. Not only was he down £4, but he also had a body to get rid of. And the pair schemed together and came up with a plan that would solve both of these problems. But before I get into the solution that they came up with, I know you've already guessed what it is, right? I know you're not stupid. Just at least let me try and, make some sort of attempt at dramatic build-up. I do need to go into a little bit of the history behind the field of anatomical research in Edinburgh. Edinburgh during this time was one of the world leaders in anatomical research, and so as a result, lots of doctors, professors, scientists, researchers all based themselves in Edinburgh so that they could study this science. One of the key places at the centre of this research was the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh. But there is one key thing that you definitely require in order to further your research and also teach anatomy to thousands of students who travelled from all over the world and were paying big money so that they could learn this field of science. There is one key thing that you definitely require in order to keep this going and keep the cash coming in. Bodies. You need bodies. You need a lot of fucking bodies. Bodies, believe it or not, were pretty hard to come by. Even back then, when people were apparently dying of stupid sounding things like dropsy. I still don't know what the fuck that is. A condition characterised by an excess of watery fluid collecting in the cavities or tissues of the body. It's also a type of fish. The man died of fish. One thing that didn't help the doctors in getting a hold of bodies is there were certain rules and legislation in place, and this legislation dictated and detailed some of the instances in which the doctors would automatically get the body. In all other circumstances, the body had to be given over by the family. But the circumstances in which the doctors would automatically get the body for dissection would be if the person died in prison, were a suicide victim, or was a child who had been abandoned by their parents, or an orphan. I'm going to assume that was after they died. It doesn't say here, but I'm going to hope that this was after they had died. This made bodies quite hard to come by, and so doctors ended up paying a large sum of money to anyone who could provide them with a body, and this ended up giving rise to the Resurrection Men of Edinburgh, who would start plundering the graveyards of Edinburgh or funeral parlours so that they could steal fresh bodies to sell to the doctors. And the doctors would always buy the bodies, no questions asked. The doctors knew fine well there was some shady shit going on, but they didn't care. The only thing they cared about was their research and making sure there was a nice, fat, steady flow of cash coming from these students and their tuition fees. There was a little bit of weird legal trouble in regards to stealing bodies. For example, stealing items from a body, or grave robbing, was a crime. Disturbing a grave was also a crime. But stealing a body itself was not considered a crime, because legislation at the time deemed a body to be no one's property. It didn't belong to anyone. So stealing one wasn't an offence. People ended up taking strong measures to make sure that their loved ones' bodies would not be stolen by the Resurrection Men. One of these methods included renting a large stone slab that would be placed over the top of the grave and left there long enough for the body to decompose to the point where it would be completely useless for dissection, and then once the body had reached that point, the slab would be lifted and moved over to the next renter. People would also buy things called mort cages. This was a metal cage that went all the way around the grave and under the ground and around the coffin itself. And see if you actually go to Greyfriars Kirkyard in the centre of Edinburgh, where a lot of these body snatchings happened, you can actually still see the mort cages. Residents of Edinburgh got so sick and fed up of their dead loved ones being stolen and sold to the universities that they ended up taking to the streets in protest, and ultimately the council ended up placing guard towers and guards in and around cemeteries and graveyards. This, paired with the mort cages and also the stone slabs, meant that stealing bodies became pretty much impossible. This made the doctors panic because it dramatically reduced the amount of bodies that they had access to, and refrigeration wasn't around back then, so see, whenever they got a body, they had to use it for one of the dissections within the next few days, otherwise it would decompose to the point where it would be useless. So the only way they could keep up with all of these classes and all of the research was to have a steady flow of bodies constantly coming in. This started to seriously affect their research, and they were starting to get desperate. And Burke and Hare knew they were desperate and decided to pay them a visit. The only problem was the other lodgers were aware of what happened. They all knew that dear old Donald had died of dropsy, so they reported the death to the police. Once the death had been reported, a carpenter, free of charge out of the goodness of his heart, provided a coffin so that dear old Donald, who died of dropsy, could be given a decent burial. Once the carpenter had left, Burke and Hare opened the coffin, removed Donald's body, and then hid the body under the bed. They knew that they would then need to weigh the coffin down so that it still felt like it had a body inside it, so they filled the coffin with tree bark. The next day, the coffin was removed for burial, and after dark, Burke and Hare sneakily transported the body through the streets of Edinburgh towards the college so that they could try and find a buyer. They asked the student for directions, just casually holding a corpse, and the student gave them directions towards the premises of Dr. Robert Knox. Dr. Robert Knox was one of the top surgeons who held daily lectures that were sometimes attended by up to 400 people, and he's widely recognised as one of the great pioneers in the field of anatomical study. Unfortunately, he was also a shady fuck. They met with Knox and haggled over the cost of the body, and eventually agreed on the price of £7 10 shillings, which was a good lump of money back then. Burke's share was £3 and 5 shillings, and Hare's share was £4 and 5 shillings. Hare's share was higher to cover the cost of the rent that he was owed from the corpse that he just sold. We have reached pecan cap. As they were leaving the premises, one of Dr. Knox's assistants told the pair that they would be very happy to see them again when they had another body to dispose of. This is when Burke and Hare had a little bit of a light bulb moment and decided to start a very profitable new career. Burke and Hare sort of decided that simply waiting for lodgers to die would just take too long, and they were busy men who needed money now, so they had the idea of speeding up the process by just murdering people themselves. Now, the problem is in the reports, there's not really that much detail as to what order the murders took place in, but there is strong evidence that the first murder they committed was a miller named Joseph. Joseph was a lodger who was living with Burke and Hare, and he fell ill with fever and had become delirious and in a very weakened state, and Burke and Hare decided that this would be a good opportunity for them to make more money. So they gave Joseph a whiskey, a very traditional Scottish mark of respect to a dying man, and then Burke lay across Joseph's chest to prevent him from struggling and also to restrict his chest so he couldn't breathe, and then Hare smothered him with a pillow. They took his body to Dr. Knox, who on this occasion gave them 10 whole pounds. Another murder victim was an Englishman whose name was never recorded. He was a travelling salesman of matches and tinder, and he was also lodging in Hare's premises, and he too fell sick, but this time with jaundice. Burke and Hare used the same method again. Burke lay across the man's torso while Hare suffocated him. Another victim was a woman named Abigail Simpson. She was an old pensioner who would travel from her village to Edinburgh to sell salt. She was actually lured onto the premises by Maggie, Hare's wife, because even their wives were in on it now. They got Abigail so drunk that she passed out, and while she was passed out, Hare smothered her with a mattress cover. Burke and Hare then transported her body in a tea chest over to Dr. Knox, who again paid them £10. Another murder, which was a bit of an eventful one, is when Burke was drinking in a bar, he met two ladies called Mary Patterson and Janet Brown, and Burke decided to invite both of them back to his brother's house for more drinks. Burke's brother left for work, and Mary drank so much that she passed out. So Burke and Janet kept drinking and talking, when suddenly Burke's wife Nellie burst into the house and started accusing Burke of having an affair. An argument started that resulted in Burke throwing a glass at Nellie's face and cutting her eye. Janet was so shocked and appalled that she was being chatted up by a married man that she decided to leave, and Nellie, with blood coming down her face and in a traditional scorned Scottish woman fury, ran off to fetch Hare and Margaret. Hare and his wife Maggie arrived, and Burke and Hare could not be bothered with Nellie and Maggie shouting at them, so they just simply locked them out of the house and started drinking. Burke and Hare then proceeded to smother Mary, who was still passed out at the table. Nellie stole Mary's skirt and petticoats, and Burke and Hare used the tea chest again to transport the body to Dr. Knox. Dr. Knox was so thrilled with the freshness of the body, even commenting that it was still warm. As they were leaving, one of Dr. Knox's assistants asked Burke and Hare where they got the body from, as he was certain that he recognised her. Burke and Hare ended up making up some story saying that the poor girl had just drank herself to death. And on this occasion, Burke and Hare were given £8 for the body, because even Dr. Knox won't pay full price for a thought. This ended up becoming the modus operandi of Burke and Hare. They would either take lodgers or drunks they found wandering the street, ply them with alcohol and get them wasted until they passed out, and then while they were passed out, they would smother them, kill them, and sell the body to Dr. Knox. What was probably one of the worst murders was when they had two lodgers. One of them was an elderly grandmother and her grandson, who was very young and he was mute and deaf. Burke and Hare killed the grandmother in the bedroom using the usual method, while the little boy sat in front of the fire, and because he was deaf he had absolutely no idea what was going on, and Burke and Hare came downstairs and carried the boy to the bedroom, where they then killed him. Burke said that this murder was the only one that affected him, and he said that he was permanently haunted by the expression on the boy's face as he killed him. Yeah, well, fucking boo-hoo you, don't kill children then, dickhead! The tea chest that they usually used wasn't big enough for both of the bodies, so they ended up stuffing both of the bodies in a herring barrel and started rolling it towards the university. They were struggling a little bit and even actually asked a porter to help them push the barrel the rest of the way, because both of them were starting to get pretty brazen at this point. This was apparently the only murder that the pair of them didn't actually speak about to each other, and it seemed to affect both of them, and they were sort of starting to question what they had become. Apparently, after returning from selling the bodies to Dr. Knox, Hare flew into a fit of rage and shot a horse dead outside of the lodgings. While Burke and Nellie were away visiting Nellie's father, Burke returned a few weeks later to discover Hare sitting at the table wearing brand new clothes. Curious, Burke asked Hare if he had sold a body while he was gone. Hare denied this, but Burke ended up going to check with Dr. Knox and asked him, "Has Hare sold you a body in the last few weeks?" And Dr. Knox confirmed that yes, Hare had actually sold a body without Burke being there. Burke was so shocked, so hurt that his best friend would murder someone without him, that he stormed home and confronted Hare, and this ended up resulting in the pair of them beating the absolute shit out of each other in the middle of the street. What a thing to fall out over! Burke and Nellie ended up moving out of the lodgings, but it didn't last for very long. Eventually Burke and Hare reconciled and they all moved back in together. One murder that did arouse a lot of suspicion was the murder of a very well-known face around the streets of Edinburgh, a homeless beggar who was called Jamie Wilson. Jamie was very well known because he was always seen roaming the streets of Edinburgh, and he was very identifiable because he had deformed feet that caused him to walk in a very strange manner, which had earned him the nickname Daft Jamie. They did their usual of luring him into the house with the promise of whiskey, but Jamie didn't get as drunk as their other victims, and Jamie was also quite a strong guy, so when Burke and Hare pounced on him, Jamie actually put up a little bit of a fight, and Burke and Hare did end up a little bit black and blue, but eventually they overpowered Jamie and managed to kill him. The next day, when the body was being examined by Dr. Knox and his students prior to dissection, a bunch of the students recognised the body. They knew it was Daft Jamie because lots of people in Edinburgh knew who Daft Jamie was. Dr. Knox, though, quickly shut them all down and told them all that this body was no one that they knew. The body was then scheduled for public dissection immediately, but before the body was wheeled out, Dr. Knox had removed Jamie's head and also Jamie's trademark deformed feet. It's almost like he didn't want anybody to know that this body was Daft Jamie. Why would he do that? It's very strange, isn't it? Big think. But then, finally came the murder that got them all caught. In October of 1828, a woman named Margaret Docherty was lured into the lodgings by Burke, Hare and their two wives with the promise of a wonderful night of singing, dancing and whiskey. The problem was, there were lodgers in the house, a couple called Anne and James Gray, and their children. Burke and Hare knew that they couldn't kill this woman with the Greys just hanging around the house, so Burke and Hare told the Greys that this woman was a visiting relative and that they would like some privacy, so Burke and Hare gave the Greys some money so that they could stay somewhere else for the night. The Greys ended up coming back the next day, but when Anne tried to go towards her own bed so that she could retrieve some items of her clothing, Burke stood in front of her and stopped her and told her not to go near the bed and wouldn't give her a reason why. This obviously made Anne a little bit suspicious. Later in the evening, Burke and Hare left to go on an errand, and Anne and James were left alone in the house. Anne and James were already a little bit suspicious as to the weird way that Burke and Hare were acting, and also because earlier on, Burke wouldn't let Anne go near the bed. So both of them snuck upstairs to go towards the bed and see why they weren't allowed near it. And that's when they found, under a pile of straw that was next to the bed, Margaret Docherty's body. They sprinted out of the house to go and tell the police, but as they were leaving the house, they bumped into Nellie. And Nellie could tell by the expression on their faces that they found the body. Nellie started pleading with them not to go to the police and even promised to pay them £10 a week if they kept their mouths shut. But James and Anne just pushed past her and ran towards the police station. Nellie ran and found Burke and Hare and told them what had happened, so Burke and Hare sprinted back to the house, grabbed Margaret's body and quickly took it to Dr. Knox's house so that they could get rid of the evidence. By the time Burke and Hare got back to their house, the police were there and searching the building, and in their rush to get rid of Margaret's body, they completely forgot to get rid of Margaret's personal items and also items of her clothing. Clothing that was stained with blood. Burke and Hare lied to the police and said that Margaret Docherty had actually left the premises the previous night. The police were very, very suspicious, but they decided not to arrest Burke and Hare then and there. The police instead went to Dr. Knox's office. So the police searched Dr. Knox's dissection room. And right there, on the table, was Margaret Docherty's body. Dr. Knox, in a panic, immediately told the police that it was Burke and Hare who sold him the body. And so, the cops went down to the infamous house that they all lived in together. And Burke, Hare, Nellie, and Hare's wife Margaret were all arrested. During the police's inquiries, a lot of people started coming forward reporting people that had gone missing who were last seen in the company of Burke and Hare, and once it had been revealed that they actually dumped the body at Dr. Knox's dissection room, a lot of people started going through the waste bins of the dissection room and were actually finding clothing that belonged to their family members. It was also discovered that Burke's nephew was seen wearing Daft Jamie's trousers. When the police investigated, they discovered that, yep, the boy was wearing Daft Jamie's trousers. So, another murder charge was added to the rap sheet. The police continued their inquiries and they had a very strong suspicion that a lot more murders had taken place that they didn't know about. The only problem was they couldn't find any evidence linking it to Burke and Hare. And they knew that the only way that they were going to be able to get the entire story was to cut a deal with one of the four suspects. The person chosen for the deal was Hare. The cops told him that if he told them about all of the murders and completely ratted on Burke and Nellie, then Hare and his wife Margaret would be completely immune from prosecution, and the only people that would be going down for the murders would be Burke and Nellie. Hare accepted the deal. The trial started against Burke and Nellie, charged with murder, and several people appeared to give statements against them. Some of the people were Dr. Knox's assistants, but the most important one was Hare himself. The trial only lasted for 2 days, but see, for those 2 days, they were pretty much permanently in the courthouse. The day of court started at 9 AM and ended up finishing at 3 in the morning on both days. Then, at 3 in the morning, on Christmas Day, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty, and Burke was sentenced to death. However, in regards to Nellie and her involvement in the murders, the jury returned a verdict of not proven, and she was released. Nellie, that very same evening, tried to return home, but unfortunately she was greeted in the street by hundreds of extremely angry people who were furious at her not proven verdict. They tried to attack her and she tried to take shelter in a local police station, but then the locals just started laying siege to the police station to try and get her. She ended up having to escape out of a back window where she ran to Edinburgh's main police station for her protection. While she was there, she asked the police if she could see Burke one last time, and they told her no. The next day, Nellie left Edinburgh and then disappeared without a trace. There are no records of her at all anywhere after this point. She just vanished. Margaret Hare, after she was released from custody, travelled to Glasgow so that she could try and get on a boat over to Ireland. Unfortunately, while she was in Glasgow, she too got recognised and she too got attacked by an angry mob. And she too also had to run into a nearby police station for her safety. She was given a police escort to a boat that was travelling to Belfast, and once she got off the boat in Belfast, she completely disappeared too. There's no record of what happened to her after that point. William Hare was kept in custody for a while longer for his own protection, and he was smuggled out of Edinburgh in disguise, riding as a passenger in a mail coach. The only problem was, the other passengers of this mail coach all recognised him and knew who he was. When they got off the coach in Dumfries, the passengers immediately started shouting, "It's William Hare, it's William Hare," to the huge crowd of people. The huge crowd of people ended up trying to attack Hare, and he ran towards the hostel that he was supposed to be staying in for the night and tried to take shelter inside. But the mob, again, laid siege to the building. Doors, windows and streetlights were all smashed, and eventually 100 special constables had to be called in to try and restore order. The police ended up sending out a decoy carriage to trick the crowd into thinking that Hare was on board so that the crowd would be distracted and attack this carriage, while the real carriage that actually had Hare in it could sneak out the back. Hare was transported to a local prison because it was the only place that the police were sure where they could keep him safe. The next day, Hare was escorted out of the town by a sheriff officer and a full militia guard. Once they were outside of the town, they told Hare to start walking towards the English border. And that is the last he was ever seen. Hare, too, completely disappeared, and there's no records whatsoever of what became of him. Nellie, Hare and Margaret no doubt changed their names immediately. They no doubt changed their names to avoid detection, to obviously prevent reprisals against them for the murders that they committed. But that just kind of means that you could be descended from them, and you wouldn't even know. I'm just saying. As for Dr. Knox, well, he was obviously investigated by the police and the university itself. The investigation deemed that he was deficient in principle and heart, but it couldn't find any evidence at all that he knew about the murders. The people of Edinburgh were obviously absolutely fucking furious about this. Dr. Knox ended up getting attacked, mocked, caricatured in the media, and people even burned an effigy of him outside of his house. Over the years though, he was slowly but surely shunned and excluded by his peers, and he even had his name removed from the roll of Fellows of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Basically, the Burke and Hare fiasco followed him around everywhere he went. He was struggling to get jobs, he was struggling to get placements at unis, and he just fell further and further down in his field, and at the time of his death, he'd actually become pretty irrelevant. Dr. Knox always maintained that neither he nor his assistants had any idea about any of these murders, and he was certain that these bodies had been procured through honest and noble means, and had he had any idea that these were murder victims, then he would never— Oh, you fucking liar! You knew! You're a lying bastard! You fucking knew! Now, what happened to Burke? Burke was hanged on the 28th of January 1829 in front of a crowd that some believe was as large as 25,000. People who actually had houses with windows overlooking the scaffolding where the execution was to take place actually started renting out space at their windows to people that wanted a good view at prices that ranged from 5 shillings to 20 shillings. But now comes a little bit of poetic justice. See, the judge didn't just sentence Burke to death. No, he added something extra special on after that. The judge said that once Burke's execution had been carried out, Burke's body was to be submitted for a public dissection, just like his victims. Burke's body was dissected at Edinburgh University's Old College by Professor Munro, and despite there only being limited tickets to this dissection, an enormous crowd turned up who were trying to get in, and this resulted in a small-scale riot. The dissection lasted for 2 hours, and during the dissection, Professor Munro did something a little bit strange. He dipped his quill pen into Burke's blood, and he wrote down, "This is written with the blood of William Burke. He was hanged at Edinburgh. This blood was taken from his head." Good to know. As for what happened to Burke's remains, his skeleton was preserved and is currently in the possession of Edinburgh University's Anatomical Museum, but it's not on public display, so the best we can do is pictures at this point. It is quite funny though, that his body is now owned by the very place he used to sell the bodies to. The entire affair is deeply entrenched in Edinburgh's history, and there's even some other legends that have come out of Edinburgh's graveyards, like Greyfriars Bobby. Bobby was a Skye Terrier that belonged to night watchman John Grey. When John died, his body was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, and Bobby guarded his grave for 14 years, until his own death in 1872. During his time in the graveyard, he became a little bit of a local celebrity, and the Lord Provost of Edinburgh even paid for his dog licence and gave him a collar, and this collar is actually on display at Edinburgh Museum. Everybody loved this little dog that had been guarding his owner's grave for 14 years. You know the episode of Futurama, "I Waited for You, Fry"? Well, that was partly influenced by Greyfriars Bobby. A statue was erected in Bobby's honour, and there's even a pub named after him, and when he died himself, he was buried in Greyfriars Kirkyard, and his grave reads, "Let his loyalty and devotion be a lesson to us all." Dogs are too pure for this earth. The Burke and Hare murders even started an old Edinburgh nursery rhyme. "Up the close and down the stair, butt and ben wi' Burke and Hare. Burke's the butcher, Hare's the thief, Knock's the boy that buys the beef." That's actually quite funny. In total, Burke and Hare killed 16 people and sold their bodies to Dr. Knox. And when you take the total amount they made from the bodies and adjust it for inflation, the total comes up to £14,250. That's how much they earned from their murders. And that's a good chunk of money. So what did they do with all that money? Because that's what it was all about at the end of the day, wasn't it? Money. That's why they did the things that they did. Because they wanted money. So did they save it? Did they buy property? Did they invest it? No. They drank it. All of it. They spent it all on booze. They murdered 16 people just so they could keep drinking.
It's Count Dankula on YouTube. Everybody should subscribe.